And welcome everyone to day 3 of our 4-day career fair in neuroscience and society. My name is Francis Shen. I direct the new Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. It's my great pleasure to welcome you and our panelists for what I know will be another great evening of conversation around the intersection of neuroscience with multiple fields. Tonight, we'll touch on neurophilosophy, neuroanthropology, neuromarketing, neuro in the arts, neuroliterature. Stick around. There are breakout sessions afterwards. Let me start, as I have done every night, with several thank yous. If you've come before, you know who I'm thanking. First and foremost, the Dana Foundation for supporting this work and for their vision. Check out their website at dana.org. Thank you to all of our student RAs, including Ithaca, who's here tonight and will be running a breakout session. This entire career fair has been fueled by students. So thank you to all of you. Thanks to the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, the home of our grant. And thanks to all of our participants as panelists and breakout leaders, faculty, as well as our partners. Check out Career Network website, neuroxcareers.org, for our full list of partners. And a special thank you to Simply Neuroscience, a global nonprofit organization started for and run by students to promote their involvement in neuroscience and psychology. There will be a breakout, Simply Neuroscience breakout after this. We'll hear from Chinmay Balusu, founder and CEO, in that breakout session. So thanks to everyone. Just a few things to know before we jump in. We will have a panel discussion starting in just a moment, where each of our panelists will talk for about 10 minutes, introduce you to their fields. That will leave us about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A at the end of this first hour. Chat is closed, but Q&A is open, so use the Zoom Q&A feature to ask your questions. We'll get to as many as we can. We won't get to them all, but that's okay, because you can stick around afterwards for breakout sessions. And we've got breakout sessions on neurophilosophy, neuroanthropology, neuroscience and narrative, and neuroliterature, as well as creating your own NeuroX major. So a lot of stuff to talk about at the top of the hour. You can come back. There's one more night after tonight. So tomorrow we'll cover neurolaw, neuroethics, neuroscience and public policy, and neuroforensic. That will be the end to our career fair. But anything you missed, we'll have recordings posted sometime next week on our website, NeuroX Careers. You can subscribe there to our newsletter and find out about all the great things that are happening in neuroscience and society. So with that, we'll get started, and I will introduce our first panelist. I'll introduce each of our panelists as we go along. We'll hear first from friend, collaborator, Dr. Patricia Churchland. Dr. Churchland has not only contributed to the fields of philosophy of neuroscience, but in my mind, really established them and established neurophilosophy, its direction and its foundations. She is a professor emeritus of philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, an adjunct professor at the Salk Institute, holding degrees from Oxford University, the University of Pittsburgh, and the University of British Columbia. She's been awarded more prizes than I can mention, but one you've surely heard of, the MacArthur Genius Prize, has been president of the American Philosophical Association and the Society for Philosophy and Psychology. There really is not a better person to talk about neurophilosophy, its origins, and where and how you might get involved than Dr. Pat Churchland. Dr. Churchland, thank you for being here amidst travels, and turn it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yes, I am traveling. I'm squatting on my bed. So that's what the headboard is, what's behind me. So when I was an undergraduate, I was really captured by an introductory philosophy course that started with the Greeks. And the Greeks were really interesting because they asked many fundamental questions about the nature of the universe, about what the sun really is, what the moon really is, what stars are, and how they relate to the earth. And they were also, of course, intensely interested in questions about us. How did we make decisions? Why did we sometimes make bad decisions? How is it that we ever hallucinate? What's sleeping for? What's dreaming for? Now, in the midst of all this, there was an interesting division between Plato on the one hand and Aristotle, much younger and kind of Plato's student, but a bit of a rebellious rascal, Aristotle. So Plato And like Descartes after him, and Chalmers most recently, thought there have to be two very different kinds of stuff in the universe. There's the physical body that does things like digests, but then there's mental stuff or spiritual stuff. And that's the stuff that does the thinking and the perceiving and the feeling and so forth. And Aristotle, who had helped his physician father for many years, was much more practical and sort of said, well, nuts. I think it's all physical. And the answer, it's not that there's a mind-body problem and how do the two connect. There's only a body problem. And what we need to know are what the mechanisms are for all of these things. Now, at that time, and this would have been in the early 60s when I studied, there wasn't that much in the way of really good techniques for studying neuroscience. So I thought, well, maybe philosophy can contribute. And so I went on and eventually went to graduate school. But it became increasingly obvious that Plato was wrong. And one of the most dramatic, I think, experiments was the split brain results, because there were two subjects, and this was done in Los Angeles. There were two subjects who had intractable epilepsy. And in order to control the epilepsy, which was intractable to drugs, they cut the corpus callosum, meaning that the two hemispheres were separated to some degree, or at least cortex was. And the really remarkable result was that you could show that each hemisphere got signals independently of the other, although through lower structures they might eventually communicate. And this seemed to me to be amazing. And Mike Gazzaniga, who was one of the people involved, said, yeah, consciousness can be split. And that's because the brain is a physical thing. And so it seemed to me that from this and other results, for example, involving the hippocampus and the necessity of having the hippocampus for learning anything new, that really the action was going to be in neuroscience. And if you really wanted to understand functions that we think of as mental, yes, psychology could give you sort of some behavioral frameworks, but the real story was going to come out of neuroscience. And so I went to the medical school at the University of Manitoba. And amazingly enough, they said, oh, this is wonderful. A philosopher wants to know something about the brain. And they gave me my own human brain in a Tupperware pot. And I was able to, along with the other students who had their brains in Tupperware pots, we were able to dissect them and learn. And eventually the neurologists heard about this strange creature amongst them. And I was invited to go to neurology rounds. And that meant I was able to see close up patients with remarkable kinds of brain damage. And because Manitoba is a huge catchment area, and all the interesting cases come to the University of Manitoba Medical School, I saw really, really wonderful things, such as a man who had a stroke, such that he could no longer recognize his cows by their face. And that bothered him tremendously. One cow looked like the next cow, and that was very sad. Yes, he couldn't recognize his wife either, but that didn't seem to him quite as profoundly disastrous. So one thing led to another, and I began to just learn as much as I could about neuroscience. Eventually, of course, the salt came to be part of the story, because I met Francis Crick at a meeting, and also Terry Sejnowski, the upshot of which was that Paul and I moved to the University of California, San Diego. And Francis and I sort of collaborated to get a hold of Terry and persuade him that the Salk Institute was the place to do computational neuroscience. And by God, that is sort of what happened. So it was all very exciting. Now, I think that philosophy, especially in Europe, has really adopted the view that it should be collaborating with people who know whatever the science happens to be. And in some cases, of course, it's anthropology. So we learned that when the famous psychologist Jerry Fodor told us that you cannot think unless you have language. Language is the key to thought. We knew that had to be false. We just showed him pictures of crows solving very complicated 8-step problems. They didn't actually have a language so far as we knew, or if they did, it certainly wasn't English. And so for many other empirical hypotheses that were favored by psychologists, but particularly favored by philosophers who thought that they could figure out the answers without looking at the data. So now we know, really, I think, that whatever the questions are, collaborating with the relevant sciences are going to be really, really important and really crucial, that you can't just make stuff up. That you can generate hypotheses, of course, but ultimately they don't matter unless you can test them. And so I think if you want to study neurophilosophy, what you want to study is, first of all, neuroscience, and then figure out what big questions are really of interest to you. I mean, like right now, what Terry Sainovsky and I are really interested in is how questions of context can enter into the coding of neurons in visual cortex. How the heck can that happen? Especially because the conventional wisdom from Hubel and Wiesel was that, you know, it's just visual all the way. And past signals or emotion signals or signals about value don't enter into it. But we know they do. Now, I think maybe my 10 minutes are up. So I think, I mean, this is going to sound very rude to many of my philosophical colleagues, but if you want to do what I call know-nothing philosophy or hot air philosophy or data scoffing philosophy, you're wasting your time. I mean, you can do it, but why would you bother when the data are coming in like crazy? But you also have to really understand the techniques. And one of the things that I find slightly awkward, shall we say, is the willingness with which people buy into data that you get from MR, from functional MR. Why am I skeptical about that? Well, because what exactly does functional MRI measure? Blood flow. It can't measure neurons directly. Now, the beauty of something like optogenetics is that we can get past the single cell story and record from many cells at once, or stimulate and record from many cells at once. But ultimately, we have to know what the networks are doing. Yes, MR might sort of, give you some limitations on what networks might be doing. But, when I see these articles saying that MR shows that, this is the way you solve a logical problem, I think nuts. I'm sorry, but it ain't likely to be true. And on that happy note, I think I better just say goodbye.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to just play my role in moderator and not jump in. I'm so tempted to do so, but we have too many other amazing presentations, including one I'm super happy to introduce, which is on neuroanthropology, our guest and expert, Dr. Chelsea Carter. Dr. Carter is a assistant professor of public health in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Yale School of Public Health, with a secondary appointment in the Department of Anthropology. She's a Black feminist anthropologist of medicine, public health, and race, and her scholarship examines the relationships between social determinants of health, such as anti-Black racism, socioeconomic status and gender, and neurodegenerative diseases, such as ALS and motor neuron diseases. This really unique background and applied work in anthropology and public health, if you check out our website, I'll post it, is leading to a new book, Finding the Forgotten: Race, Bias, and Care in the World of ALS. And she's extensively involved in community engaged research. The coolest thing I'm going to say personally is that we learned in preparation for this event that we're both from St. Louis, Missouri, and we both went to the same grade school, New City School, where kids come first. So shout out New City School, shout out Tom Herr, shout out Multiple Intelligences and learning in all sorts of different ways. We have to be featured, Chelsea, in the alumni magazine, now that we said that. But really, it's wonderful for you to be here. And I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Shen. I am honored to be here and share a little bit of my story with each of you and kind of how I wound up in this neuroanthropology field. Really grateful for being on the panel with everyone. And thank you to Dr. Churchland for your comments. What a hard act to follow. So I'm going to try not to follow it and just share a little bit about myself. So first, I think I'll say that I am a complete imposter in neuroanthropology. I truly am a person who I followed a disease of interest. And so I wouldn't particularly say that I have like extensive training in neuroscience. But what I did was I followed a passion that I was really interested in since high school. So like Dr. Shen mentioned, grew up and actually am in St. Louis right now, born and raised, and had a lot of privileges to go to really great schools, even though I was zoned to a school district that was not as great and was unaccredited at the time that I was coming up. And so I had the unique opportunity when I got to high school to go to a high school here in St. Louis called John Burroughs, where they had a lot of extracurricular activities for students. And one of the particular things that we had is we had like morning assemblies once a week. And in these assemblies, it would be a variety of topics that we would address, from summer opportunities to guest speakers to really famous people that would come and showcase their work. We've had a couple of MacArthur geniuses to alumni of the institution that would come just share their stories. And so I have a vivid memory of being in 9th grade and Jack Orchard coming to an assembly. And I remember actually being late that day because my mom always made me late for school. And I regret now that she made me late because I slid into assembly and into my seat. And remember that an ABC video was up kind of showing the relationship between Jack and his then wife and the toll that ALS had on his body. And so one of the things that Jack was wanting to do was create a non-medical palliative kind of healthcare network of high school students and college students to go into the homes of ALS patients. And so for me, I had never even heard of ALS before. And so after hearing them talk, I'm hearing, oh, Lou Gehrig's disease. And so I'm like wanting to do more research. But I think what was really striking to me is that Jack came to that particular presentation. And then he came 6 months later. And at the first presentation, he was speaking on his own, able to present on his own. And in 6 months later, his wife was having to do all of the communication for him because of the debilitation of a neurodegenerative disease like ALS, which even though that was, showing my age, 16, 20 years ago now, was actually, we still don't know a lot about it, even though we have a lot of palliative treatments and we have a couple of therapies. They're not curing, they're not life extending significantly. And so despite the fact that it's been over 20 decades, 20 years, 2 decades, there's a lot that still needs to be learned about ALS. So high school Chelsea then was really moved by what she saw, what she learned, all of these things. And I was like, how do I get involved? And so after doing my research, I really realized, I think the biggest takeaway was that it was a disease with no cure, and a disease that was very fast paced. And I think the empath in me was really moved by that. And I wanted to know, like, how can I be involved? How can I support? What can I do? Very long story short, by the time I graduated high school, I was volunteering with 3 different families impacted by ALS in the St. Louis area, going into their home, babysitting, doing laundry, any type of non-medical task you can think of, to me, that could just kind of make the disease easier for the family. And during that time, I think particularly as a Black girl in St. Louis, I realized of the people I was seeing at ALS walks and people I was meeting when I would go and visit ALS clinics, no one looked like me except one family once I got to my junior year of high school. And so I kept asking myself, quite literally, where are all the Black people with ALS? Like, this disease, I'm sure, impacts multiple groups. Why are we not seeing Black people, and then even more broadly, people of color showing up, particularly in St. Louis, in these clinical spaces where we have a population well over 50% minority? And so from there, I really thought I was going to be a neurologist, and I went down to Emory to actually major in neuroscience and become a neurologist. And then I took orgo, and that quickly took the light out of me. And I was like, you know what? I could probably try to do something different. And during that time, I really fell in love with anthropology. It was one of the first classes I took my freshman year. And I think I was kind of obsessed with it because I was like, wow, here's a subject and a discipline that kind of thinks the way I think, and is teaching me different theories and models. And I was obsessed with the concept of cultural relativism when I was younger, and how, like, we can't just show up in people's cultures and tell them what to do. I also was obsessed with the idea of culture and understanding not only big kind of macro cultures, but also what are smaller cultures doing? What does culture look like for Black people in the United States? What's it look like for Black people in the Midwest of the United States? And so I got really interested in just understanding culture from a purely kind of cultural anthropology, philosophical perspective. And I remember after kind of that orgo debacle, coming into one of my professors, and I was like, I don't think I want to go to med school anymore. And I think I should do something else. How can I weave these interests together? And she literally said to me, she was like, you can be a medical anthropologist. And I was like, what is that? And so she began to explain to me kind of the ways I could take my medical interest and dovetail it with this language of anthropology really well. And so I remember my senior year, I did an honors thesis while I was down at Emory, because I started getting really involved in the Emory ALS clinic and the ALS Association of Georgia. And I wanted to do a study. I wanted to investigate what I was seeing. And so that race question was still always in the back of my mind. But unfortunately, as we see in a lot of anthropology disciplines, there aren't a lot of people that look like me and that are willing to engage in questions of race. And so the advisor that I had at the time was like, no, let's not do race. How about we do gender? And I was like, cool, I'm 21. What do I have to lose? But that project and having the opportunity to create my own research, create my own ethnographic project, and really ask these big macro questions of, what are you experiencing as a woman with ALS? What are you experiencing as a man with ALS? What are you experiencing as a non-binary person with ALS? And I started learning and gleaning so many interesting findings that I was like, okay, this definitely is something that I'm interested in, want to kind of continue in. And during that time, I joined the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, which is a fellowship that supports underrepresented students in the academy to go on and get PhDs. So I already kind of had an inkling that I wanted to get a PhD, but I also knew that I wanted to be a well-rounded human. And so that I should probably not go straight from undergrad to a PhD program. And so after that, I went and immediately worked at the Muscular Dystrophy Association, which actually has both an ALS function and also focuses on other neuromuscular diseases and muscular dystrophy broadly. And I learned everything I think I thought I knew about ALS and neuromuscular diseases completely got debunked when I was actually in the community, working with people, going to the clinics in Atlanta. There were 2 muscular dystrophy clinics at Emory, one at the Children's Hospital up in Dunwoody. And it gave me just like a really rich kind of understanding of this disease is showing up differently for different people. These diseases, rather, are showing up differently. And what can I do, both in my role as kind of this healthcare service coordinator and social worker, but what can I also do as someone who's interested in possibly going on and studying these diseases? And so, to spare you my whole CV, I then kind of left that job because nonprofits will burn you out. And I went and worked at Northwestern Mutual as a benefits broker person. And this was in the height of healthcare reform and Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. And so I'm suddenly now getting thrown into the insurance world, literally having to take tests on like ACA changes and how people are receptive to Obamacare, what small employers can do, what large employers can do. And it's teaching me that in addition to what I'm observing and seeing in my own life and my own experiences as a volunteer or employee of ALS or neuromuscular agencies, there's a lot going on structurally from a policy level. And so I think after about my third year out of college, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready. And so I applied to programs in narrative medicine and also in anthropology, because I think one thing that I really I think I appreciated about anthropology is that it really can teach you methods around kind of deep participant observation, deep interviews, mapping, getting to know people and understanding all the idiosyncrasies that help shape who they are, their culture, and their understandings. And so I did 6 years of grad school and did a project that I at first thought was going to be in Costa Rica, or kind of doing the traditional ethnographer, anthropologist that goes abroad. And I had a really good mentor who said, hold on, there's this amazing anthropologist named Zora Neale Hurston who actually just turned her spyglass inward and looked at her own community in Edenville, Florida. What if you follow that tradition? And so I kind of push back against the traditional anthropology kind of approach to doing ethnography and say, you know what, let me turn my lens in deeper. I can learn a lot about St. Louis. Also, this was right after the Ferguson uprisings happened. And so there was a lot of race stuff going on in St. Louis that was also, I think, an entry point to think through these big questions of where are all the Black people with ALS, but also how is race and policy and the state really shaping healthcare access, how people are understanding disease, but then also how the scientists and clinicians that study ALS are reifying some of these kind of scientifically racist ideas about what diseases certain people can get. And so, long story short, all of that has dovetailed, I think, into Dr. Shen's, beautiful kind of, summary of my work and working in this neurodegenerative space, but really with a health equity and a race focus, because I think one of the big questions that I've been following since I was 14 is really asking not only where are all the Black people with ALS, but really asking where are the underrepresented folks in diseases that we don't always think of are impacting people of color. One of the things that's really challenging about the US is we want to lump and categorize people so badly that sometimes it really kind of creates this myopic view of how disease really impacts people. And so we have this assumption that Black people can only get diabetes and heart disease and these big chronic diseases, and then it leaves us out from investigating all of these other rare and neurological diseases that impact people in really significant ways. So I think if I were just to leave you with kind of 3 really big things, I would love any students on the call to really follow your passion. Follow that thing. If you find a thing when you're 14 or 15, keep asking the big questions, because it might lead into a career where you're a professor and you get to study that and create your own lab and ask really big questions that are important, that it can change the world and how we think about rare disease and neurodegenerative disease, or whatever disease group or question you have. Ask the big questions consistently. Even when people tell you no, people will tell you, actually, let's think about gender. Actually, let's think about, XYZ thing. If you have something you're really passionate about, like I was about race, follow that thing. And the last thing I would say is stay engaged with the communities that you want to work with. I think whatever your questions are, we can't do this work in silos. And I think that kind of forging this career in neuroanthropology as I have, it's been really rich and rewarding to not only do that in the communities that I work with and see those individuals as knowledge producers and not just people I'm extracting knowledge from, but people who are creating with me, but also the people that you meet in undergrad and grad school, et cetera, that can be a part of your academic and neuroscience community that will help sustain you for a really long time. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit of my story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter. That was great. And we're going to move right into our next panelist. In the interest of time, though, I put in the chat that please ask your questions. We'll do it in Q&A. We'll do as much as we can, and maybe we can type some questions as we go along. Our third panelist tonight I'm really excited about, because when we created this network and tried to put together this event, we wanted to be sure, since it's about careers, that we didn't just have panelists of professor after professor. I mean, it's good. These are new fields. You kind of need academics to help explain, but you who are on the audience need to get jobs in the real world. And so I'm so excited that we have Marcia Diaz-Claudio, someone who embodies the idea of applying lessons from the mind sciences in the real world in really creative ways. Marcia is a consumer researcher discovering the why in human behavior to create innovative and insightful strategies that are actionable and understandable. And currently she's using those skills as a research and insight analyst at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Previously, she's consulted in a variety of contexts. She trained at Maastricht University School of Business and Economics, gaining a master's in neuroeconomics and running her own experiments there about the interaction between valuation, motivation, and working memory. There, she also served as the co-creator of the Maastricht Decision Science Research Group. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights across really many dimensions: art, storytelling, decision-making, neuroeconomics. Thank you, and turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that great introduction. I'm super grateful and super happy to be here today. And yes, as you mentioned, I've always been, I think that I could describe myself initially as always been very curious as a child and very drawn to the nature of what interdisciplinary disciplines could be, which in that case, I would say that this might resonate with a lot of people that, like, when they're in their bachelor's, they're just confronted with liking so many things at the same time, which was my case as well. And I think like that sort of approach was the one that led me to economics, and I started off there. Particularly, I'm very fond of mathematics, fond of very analytical approaches, and also then very much curious about the society or the psychology behind it, or especially the decision making, like how are people reaching XYZ different decisions. As I was pursuing my bachelor's, still quite confused about what I wanted to do, I approached several professors telling them like I'm very interested in continuing to doing a master's in economics and like further exploring what this field is. And I got really lucky of having a professor who recommended me to go to Germany to study and do a master's in economics. As a person born and raised in Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, I had never imagined that I would live and study in Mannheim in Germany. It was a great cultural shock, great meaning, great education. It was an amazing and really, really great experience for me getting out of the island, getting out of my surroundings. I think like as I continue my story, I think I will like jump in and give some advices. And I think that getting out of your comfort zone, specifically also like culturally and exploring other types of education systems, I think was truly beneficial to me in order to feel very much complete as a student as well, and trying to understand how other approaches and ways of studying the same field were occurring. So to me, that was very, very interesting. And however, as I was doing my master's in economics, the the thing that many people don't want to happen, I started getting bored, which I think it's also great. I think it's a great thing to experience, because it's definitely something that your mind, your body, everything is telling you, you should maybe start thinking of something else. So the boredom to me was specifically, I'm still, and I was very interested in decision making, or I just found all of these economic models so stale, in the sense of their assumptions being so carried over to what we do or think or pursue in these moments and these models. So I started asking a lot my professors, like, what do I want to do? And then my experimental economics professor told me, well, there's actually going to be happening a neuroeconomics seminar conference here at Mannheim. So maybe you want to go and check it out. So that's what I did. I started talking with a bunch of other professors from neuroeconomics, and I got to know that there was a program in Zurich in Switzerland, a lab specifically specifying in neuroeconomics. And after insisting a lot and having a lot of emails ignored, I kept insisting and got into the lab, and I was able to collaborate for a year doing whatever they wanted me to do. Meaning I was coding, I was giving the papers for the surveys, or like recruiting participants, etc. So anything that I could get my hands on to knowing or understanding, or at least being exposed to different neuroscientific tools, and how is it that they are creating research concerning neuroeconomics. So after I had that experience, I was really sure that I wanted to pursue that career, that academic career in neuroeconomics. And I found the only research master in neuroeconomics happening in Maastricht, which it was a super interesting experience, in the sense that I am formed, so to speak, as an economist, and then I am being bombarded with all of this neuroscience in a very aggressive way, because it's a very intense program, and you have 2 months for a neuroanatomy class. So, like, this is like very intense. As an economist, not having even a biology class before, it was very challenging. But I think that another advice that I would give, and something that I truly learned from all of these neuro X, Y, Z careers, is that they're highly interdisciplinary. And one true skill that I truly gained was, how do I manage interdisciplinary research? How do I do that? How can I be efficient with that, lacking maybe knowledge from one field and having strength from the other? How can I collaborate with other people that have strengths where I'm weak as well? Where can I nurture that collaboration and also support my colleagues in that? And I also gain a lot of experience. So once I was reaching the end of my research master's in neuroeconomics, I knew that I knew that I didn't project myself to be completely in academia, but I did also feel like I still wanted to have more research experience. So what I did was that I knew that if I went out into the field, I've always been fond of art, and I've always been fond of cultural institutions. So I said, well, I've been reading as a hobby. I started reading about neuroaesthetics, which is basically, how are people perceiving a piece of art? How do they perceive dance? How do they perceive theater? How do people feel when they see XYZ color, etc.? So I decided to look, as Francis mentioned, right, at the interaction of, I wanted to deepen my knowledge into value-based memory. And I wanted to understand, how do people value paintings, and how is the information that is associated to these different paintings actually being remembered? Because I know that a museum can be overwhelming with all the information, and I wanted to understand a bit more what is making people remember the information, because at the end of the day, a museum is an educational institution for society. So in the midst of that, and doing those experiments and having that great experience with my supervisor, I understood that definitely this was something that I wanted to pursue. However, I just felt like a bit of an amateur, I would say, when it came to research, and I wanted to gain more experience on that end to feel more confident and more independent. So then I applied for a researcher position in Maastricht University, specifically in consumer behavior and decision making. And the reason why I decided to kind of like I started backing off a bit from neuroscience was because I knew that I could say, well, I have all of these techniques and I've done all of these experiments and I've learned all of these like TMS or fMRI and getting engaged with all of these experiments. But then to an employer, they're going to be like, great, but we don't have that here. And what are you going to do? Like, so I went into the marketing department and I started engaging myself more, not so much like it was marketing experiments, but they were also very highly psychology based. And I did have the opportunity of also engaging with other neuroscience fields and neuroscience colleagues and making and founding this decision neuroscience group, which was highly needed in the marketing department, also collaborating with different PhD students, etc. So all in all of this happened. My contract was about to end, and I was 100% sure that I really wanted to pursue a career in the museum and art space. But I definitely had to have a hard look into the mirror, and I knew that I was just basically mostly an academic person. Like I was a researcher. I am still a researcher. And I needed to find a way. How can I get out of the way? How can I do something that I can still keep my career in academia and still in the back end just continue and sort of build my profile in the job market? So that's when life sometimes just brings you opportunities out of nowhere, right? So I just I was with a friend back home. He was finalizing his PhD and we started talking about data, et cetera, and all of the things that we were doing. And one conversation led to the other. And we said, like, why don't we just open like a research consultancy company in Puerto Rico? I would work remotely from the Netherlands. And that's how it happened. And I slowly just started acquiring projects with the Institute of Culture in Puerto Rico and also doing projects for the orchestra and the symphony in Puerto Rico, and really trying to understand their audiences. What is happening with their artisans? Like, how are they doing financially? Like, how are their events performing, etc. And I think that obviously I am not pursuing a pure career in neuroscience now. And I would say that the benefit that I got from really connecting with neuroscience was, one, truly understanding how these underlying mechanisms are functioning, particularly in decision making, because I know that there's a lot of hype when it comes to neuroscience, especially in the job market. It's so easy to just show a really pretty picture of an fMRI and just pretend like, oh, it's lighting up, so it means this and that and X or Y, which is like a very much overestimated conclusion, and it's completely not real. So I think that neuroscience really gave me that, like, putting my feet on the ground and saying like, okay, this is how it truly functions. If I would really want to apply neuroscience in an economic marketing setting, this is how I have to do it. These are how I would use the resources in order to actually be informed. And I honestly didn't know that a research and insights analyst position could actually even exist in a museum. I thought that I was just going to invent this museum. I was going to knock on doors and be like, hello, I have all of these skills and you need me and you don't know it. But I got lucky, and this position at the Whitney Museum opened up. And I applied for it, and I'm super, like, I'm still like amazed that I got it. And I'm so happy because I spent about 5 years really thinking about how can I make myself attractive to the job market, even though I keep pursuing and polishing my skills in research. Which I think this leads me to my last final advice, which would be, I think that when we pursue an academic career, which is so deeply interdisciplinary, sometimes it's hard to And I believe that this might also vary depending on the field, but in my case, in my experience, it was really hard for me to sell myself because I was having people tell me, well, you're not exactly an economist, but you're not exactly a neuroscientist. So what are you? Right? Like, what actual skills do you have and what are you actually going to bring to the table? So I think that it is very important to know how to sell yourself because that's how it works in the job market. You need to know what are your skills, what are you bringing, and I think like also just not underestimating the skills that you're developing in the academia, because I think that sometimes we think like we're just studying, we're just reading papers and we're just talking and doing these experiments, etc. But actually you're project managers, right? You're actually having so many soft skills like managing people, communication skills, presentation skills. Like how do you just get in front of a bunch of people in a conference and you just say all your research, and you have to be in front and you have to defend it and you have to be ready. So I think that a really good exercise that I had, which really helped me, was I was already building a resume before I was even thinking of applying for a job, because I really had to translate those skills into what the job market looks like. But it also was very important to me because it made me realize like I have all of these skills that sometimes when you're so much into the academic field, they just get a bit lost because people, not necessarily people are thinking, oh, I have to sell myself, or this is like how the hustle, so to speak, would work within the job market. So this is basically how I ended up working as a research and insights analyst at the museum, where I basically focus more on audiences. How are they engaging? How are they perceiving their experience? Are they happy? Are they not happy? What do they dislike? What are their preferences, etc.? And using neuroscience as a base to really interpret this data in the best way possible. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you for sharing your story and your advice. We have one final panelist, and it's Dr. Natalie Phillips. I'll introduce in just a moment. A procedural note: given the time, what we'll do is we'll hear from Dr. Phillips. We will probably just have to answer our Q&A on the type, and then we'll introduce our breakout sessions, and you can dive deep with many of our breakout rooms into the questions you have. Maybe some of our panelists will be able to stick around for a few extra minutes and answer those questions, but that's how we'll proceed. It's another great pleasure for me to introduce our final presenter for the evening, Dr. Natalie Phillips. She's an associate professor of English, affiliated faculty in the cognitive science program, and founder and co-director of the Digital Humanities and Literary Cognition Lab, the DHLC at Michigan State University. She specializes in 18th century literature, the history of mind, cognitive approaches to fiction, and disability studies. And relevant to tonight's conversation, she is one of the leading figures in the emerging new field of literary neuroscience. Listen up, pioneering a series of experiments that use neuroscientific tools such as eye tracking and fMRI to explore the cognitive dynamics of literary reading. I'm just going to share a couple of cool experiments that the DHLC has done. fMRI study of literary attention and Jane Austen, neuroscientific study on the pleasures of poetry reading, and a cross-cultural project on narrative perceptions of music. I mean, how can it get any cooler than that? Thank you, Dr. Phillips, for being with us. I know as you are also amidst travels, but you made it, and we're excited you did, and turn it over to you to learn about those experiments and more. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I know we have 10 minutes, so I can't decide whether to just race through really fast.
No, I think you should take your time and do your 10 minutes. And, you know, because we've got people are going to stick around for breakouts, and they'll come and go as they can. So say what you want to say. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to do a screen share. We'll see. You guys will see some brain images. I want to take into account what the other speakers had said. Brain images should be interpreted very cautiously, really cautiously. And so, you know, anyway, I'm happy to stay after to talk about fMRI and the really intricate work that's needed to be able to do really grounded work in this aspect of neuroscience. So yeah, I'm Natalie Phillips, and I am one of the people who, as it turned out, accidentally founded Neuroliterary Studies, in particular by running this study, this fMRI study of literary attention in Jane Austen, which is now known in the media as Your Brain on Jane. And I would like to correct that and point out that the whole study is about attention. But again, when it started out, I was a PhD in English, studying 18th century literature and the history of distraction. And now I'm an English professor at MSU, as you know, affiliated faculty in cognitive science, and I run this interdisciplinary lab. And what's really cool about the interdisciplinary lab for me is not just the amazing experiments we get to do, we get to work with global collaborators, but that it actually brings together students from neuroscience and English and computer science and education and beyond. And people just, they flock to it in this really powerful way because it is an interdisciplinary space. So that's something I'm really proud of, the DHLC. So let's see. Let me make sure you guys can actually see this. Yes, there we go. All right, fMRI study, literary attention in Jane Austen. Here's, all right, so yeah, to be frank, I had absolutely no intention of being the first to do a literary fMRI, exploring what happens in the brain when we read literature, which is just one way of defining neuroliterary studies. And I had no idea I was the first, which is a very good thing, actually, as it turns out. Our study of attention and Austen in particular combined fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, and fMRI compatible eye track to investigate neural differences between two types of literary attention. So I was really interested in attention and attention differences. I was looking at close reading, so when we can pay like a heightened form of literary analysis, and pleasure reading, a more relaxed form of literary engagement. And inside the scanner, participants moved through one chapter by Jane Austen, paragraph by paragraph, using a button press in their hand to move forward at their own pace. And actually at the end, they got out and wrote, they answered a ton of questions, but actually I asked them to write a short literary essay in response to the sections they close read. So what's really cool about this study and some of the other ones that we're doing is that we found not only that people were able to read and enjoy reading inside the scanner, something that none of you should be assuming is true or easy inside an MRI scanner, but there are powerful cognitive differences between these forms of literary attention for each subject. And here's one example, and again, it's just one example of activation for close reading in red and pleasure reading in blue, but this is just one subject. And I can come back to that as desired. What was so interesting about the study, though, is that we came up with new ways to test natural reading, moving through reading at your own speed, and literary attention. So when I talked with my neuroscience friends about how to tell whether or not people were close reading Jane Austen or doing this form of literary attention, the dominant cognitive model was like true false comprehension questions, like, was the heroine on the stairs when or in the closet when the hero showed up, or, you know, but that method just wasn't going to cut it when it came to close reading. When you close read something, you don't just end up with an understanding of the events. You are thinking about how the story is told. If you come back to what Marcia was talking about, like thinking about how the art piece is created and how your engagement with it is working, and which is why we had the participants writing these literary essays at the end. And so this gave us really surprising results. And they actually, because as it turned out, they ended up quoting. So you have to remember, they're inside the scanner, reading with a mirror above their eyes, screen at the back of the scanner, and they ended up quoting by memory and at length, up to like 4 or 5 word phrases, down to semicolon structures from whole sections of Jane Austen's novel that they'd actually read with close attention. And that's the area in red in this graph. So inside a loud scanner, through the mirror of their eyes, correctly IDing the sections, which were intentionally randomized for every other subject. And so these extensive quoting patterns, and there were over 160 quotes for 18 essays, they give us a whole new way of mapping which paragraphs and sections capture attention across a chapter, and for analyzing the levels of attention granted each block of reading. I know this is a really dorky academic moment, but it's a way of being like, oh my God, what the hell is capturing people's attention in this novel, and how are they actually managing to achieve this task? So my point is not just to dork out with you guys, but to say, had I just been a neuroscientist with no knowledge of the history of mind instead of a literature PhD, I never would have designed it this way. But had I stuck with what's traditional for a literature PhD, I wouldn't have ended up designing and running an fMRI experiment ever. Which brings us to our first piece of advice. Hopefully, if this slide will move forward. There we go. No, it's going to give you just a second one. So the first piece of advice is don't be scared of doing something new. The desire to do this for me came while I was working on that dissertation on the history of distraction. And everyone was telling me that it was not a good idea to do, I really wanted to integrate work from cognitive science on attention into this work on the history of distraction. Everyone was like, no, this is absolutely not possible, which made me want to do it even more. And so I read everything I could get my hands on. It was like attention books, cognitive science, everything. And then I started to read the fMRI studies and all of the background studies for that. And so looking at what captures our focus, experiments divided attention, sustained concentration. And then it was happenstance. As it turned out, my best friend Sam worked in MR physics doing brain scans. And I would volunteer to help her as often as I could. And she was actually the one that I proposed that I design my own fMRI experiment on attention and literature. To which I replied, absolutely not. That this was absolutely impossible. And over time, as I became more familiar with fMRI and then began to develop this network of collaborators, began to get excited about testing my own hypothesis. So that's the second piece of advice. Don't just read all the studies you can find by yourself. Talk to people, lots of them, and learn as much as you can about the tools, MRI, fMRI, eye tracking, hands-on, EEG. Get yourself into the scanner, get in a scanner, learn to run a human subject if you can, or squash, which has approximately the same water content as the brain. So, do what you can. So again, because Sam was a radiologist, I did brain scans whenever she needed to, or I talked to her and other neuroscientists endlessly about experiment design. Once we were sure we wanted to do fMRI, we set up a time to do a basic finger tapping study, which activates certain motor cortex regions, but also just to know what it felt like to be inside and do a task. And so as it turned out, I also got lucky. Stanford Center for Neurobiological Imaging opened at the same time. And I talked to them, and our conversation actually led to them teaching me how to run folks in the new 3T MRI scanner that had just opened. And so down to the human subject, a lot of the times, even psychologists and neuroscientists aren't running subjects. And that can be incredibly valuable because it gives you a sense of how to get people in the scanner, and down to the earplugs, down to the pillows, down to the bracketing, down to how much someone's head can move without disrupting the brain imaging. And so you get a really profound sense, and you then can lay on your back in the scanner and get a sense of what your task is trying to do, or whatever neuroscientific tool you're using. But again, try to actually get in there, and use it. And this leads me to my final piece of advice. Because it's be radically interdisciplinary if you can. Just do it. Because it was not just me who learned from the neuroscientists. Because interdisciplinarity doesn't just go one way. One of my favorite moments in this process of gathering together all these collaborators was this evening when our group of everyone got together, and we were all sitting together that night, and something just clicked or flipped. And the scientists, neuroscientists and the radiologists all started waxing poetic, and I'm not joking, about Jane Austen's style, particularly the sarcasm. And the literature folks just got insanely excited about literary variables and experimental variables. And when I look back, it was this kind of magical moment, this kind of interdisciplinary moment where people start understanding one another's languages. And so now that's part of my motto. That's what I want to share with you guys. I know it's 6:02. So this is all I'm going to say. Neurosciences get better when we don't just think about what science can add to literature or art or economics, any of these things, but about what our everyday experiences here of fiction or literature can add to the neuroscientific experiments of testing them. So no matter whether you come from the humanities or sciences or both, I encourage you, don't just stay in your box, break out, talk to folks in other disciplines and get excited first about what neuroscience can show us, and then about how it and you can grow. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. And it's just, I wish we had more time right now to sort of talk with all of you a bunch. A couple of our panelists have had to, as I knew they would, leave at the top of the hour, but some may be able to stick around. This is great advice all around, and you're about to have opportunities, everyone on the call, for more, because our many breakout room colleagues have joined. So here's what we'll do. We will, in the interest of giving those breakout rooms times as well, I'm going to ask each of our I'll introduce you and then have you say just a word about what you'll talk about or what you could talk about in your breakout room. So just a little bit of background on your field or your expertise. And then we'll open the breakout rooms. And then at that point, what we'll do is we will, I'll just stick around here. And if any of the panelists want to stick around, you're welcome to, and we can take questions here as well. I think that will get everything, give everyone a chance to ask your questions where you want to. So let's do it that way. And each of these breakout room presenters, students should know, are also volunteering their time, as did our presenters. So let's go down the list. We'll start with, it just worked out this way, the two Patricks, both in neurophilosophy. I'll introduce first Patrick Hopkins, who is a professor of philosophy, the Jenny Carlisle Golding Chair in Philosophy, and director of the Neurophilosophy major at Millsaps College. He's a philosopher who does crossover work in science, law, and business, and professor at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, working with their Bioethics Center and Psychiatry Department. Really relevant to this, and for students who are interested in neurophilosophy, he regularly works with students and has designed that major to be set up for students and gives them a chance to work on their own ideas, spending less time in classrooms and more working on real experiments. And so we can talk maybe about you. You probably don't have that major at your college, but could talk with you about what it might be like to explore those. So Dr. Hopkins, do you want to just unmute for a second? Let me see, make you co-host. Here we go. And just say a word about what you might talk about in that breakout room, or what students could come talk with you about.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, just great.
I got a message that I couldn't unmute myself, but okay. Yeah, so I started our neurophilosophy major about 6 or 7 years ago, and I largely wanted it to be essentially a dual major in philosophy and neuroscience. It ended up being called neurophilosophy for various institutional reasons. But for anyone who's interested in it, there are essentially two ways to approach the neurophilosophy. One is to use neuroscience to address questions of perennial interest in philosophy. I do moral psychology, but there's a lot of stuff that has to do with intuitions in epistemology and those kinds of things. And that tends to be probably the most popular way to approach things in our department. The second thing to do is to use particularly philosophy of science and epistemology tools to understand, critique, strengthen, criticize neuroscience. And as Natalie was saying a while ago, it really does work both ways. It is really kind of amazing sometimes at how a neuroscientist and psychologist may simply have not thought of some sort of questions or ideas that other disciplines have thought of, and it can be very useful. And so if anyone comes to my session, I'm happy to tell you what kind of students typically select our major, because it's turned out to be a particular kind of student. And for anyone who's interested in what careers there are not a lot of neurophilosophy careers that are listed in the want ads or on LinkedIn. So what typically happens is that they will pursue something else, but there is some reason that they have chosen the neurophilosophy major because it gave them access to skills and a certain type of self-directed research approach that wasn't available in our neuroscience major or our regular philosophy major.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. Same topic, different approach, creating a neuro major. Ithaca Senthilnathan is a member of our lab, also a senior at Duke. Ithaca, just want to just unmute and say just very briefly what you'll be talking about in your breakout room, also related to sort of majoring in these fields.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share a little bit about my experience. As Dr. Shen mentioned, I'm a senior at Duke, and I went through a process of kind of looking at a bunch of interdisciplinary fields, addition to neuroscience, looking at ethics, public policy, philosophy, kind of putting it all together, meshing it into one big major that I didn't feel like Duke offered, and that I'm sure not a lot of schools offer. So I went in and kind of created my own major, something a little bit unique. So happy to share my experience on what that process was like, what finding research, what finding courses was like, kind of looking for any opportunities in those fields. But yeah, excited to meet some of you.
Great, thank you. Let me introduce next our other neurophilosopher, but also representing the student group Simply Neuroscience. And that is, now you're gonna have to help me with your last name, Patrick. Patrick Bionias, correct me in a second.
Bionias.
Bionias, okay. So he is the co-director of the Brain Resource Creation at Simply Neuroscience, and also a PhD student in computational neuroscience at Boston University, a researcher with experience and expertise in both educational neuroscience and neurophilosophy. Patrick, do you just want to say a quick word about what you guys might be talking about in your breakout room?
Sure. Yeah. So contrary to Patrick, who was talking a little bit about how he takes more of a traditional neurophilosophy approach, I am a practicing neuroscientist. I study anesthesia and consciousness with a lowercase c, so not the more philosophical topic. But I basically take tools from philosophy to try to improve measurement approaches and interpretation of multidimensional time series in neuroscience. And so in my undergraduate, I did a lot of philosophy work. I did a lot of mathematics work. I majored in neuroscience. So I'm happy to talk about those experiences and sort of how they have sort of landed me where I am here. But also just happy to answer any of the types of questions that were directed at Patricia Churchland earlier, since it might be an interesting conversation. So happy to be here. But
great,
yeah.
Thank you. Let's go next. I'll introduce Dr. Claire Grahl, who is a behavioral researcher at StoryFit and was previously a postdoc in neuroscience, where she used a program research using fMRI, continuous response measurement, eye tracking, behavioral and evidence to examine how narrative content drives audience brain function underlying behavior, and also a graduate student before that in Michigan State, so a strong connection there. And we've labeled it neuroscience and storytelling, or corporate storytelling, neuroscience and narrative. Dr. Grahl, thanks for being with us. You want to say a quick word about what you might talk about in your breakout room, what students can come discover with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a researcher at StoryFit Now, which is a startup that develops predictive audience insights from script text alone using machine learning and AI. The only reason I'm at this career now is because of the work that I did in my postdoc and my graduate work. So I completed my PhD at Michigan State, where I combined neuroscience and mass communication. So the field of communication is what my PhD is in. So I did that to study how narratives influence audience brain function. So trying to broaden out our understanding of audience brains and how they synchronize and work together when listening to narratives or different types of messages. I then went on to Dartmouth and kept carving out this space, trying to get neuroscientists to see all the ways we can use media and media psychology to study brain function. So I can talk about media psychology, social neuroscience, the practical implications of combining them in interdisciplinary work. I could also talk about working at a startup and, applying that to the entertainment industry.
This is great. Next is on the same sort of neuro and literature communications thread. It's Kelly Mahaffey. She is a graduate student currently in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Connecticut, focusing her work on developmental psychology. And here tonight because she is rooted in the humanities with a BA in English and a master's in English as well, and is now combining those literary and scientific interests with a research focus on reading comprehension, development of language and reading, and brain structure and function underlying language abilities, and can speak from the in the trenches perspective of a graduate student trying to sort of bridge some of these areas. Kelly, do you just want to say a brief word maybe about what you might talk about with students in your breakout?
Great. Yes, I'm Kelly. I'm a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, or hoping to be in my adult career. We'll see. And I study the development of reading ability, especially when that reading ability goes awry. So things like dyslexia and the kind of comprehension equivalent of that. But I come from an education and a literary background. So trying to think really pointedly about why we read and why we should care about reading as something we develop. In my other life and career, I'm also an MRI tech and a pediatric and special populations imaging specialist. So if you have questions about how to put kids or people with autism or other developmental disorders into a scanner or an EEG cap, happy to talk about that as well.
Thank you so much. Last but certainly not least is Dr. Greg Downey, who wins the award for farthest person away, I think, living in Sydney and chiming in from there. So good morning, I think, right? Good evening. Yes. Dr. Downey is a teacher, writer, and anthropologist who's conducted field research in Brazil, the United States, and the Pacific. And he is really the founder and greatest advocate for the new field of neuroanthropology, which is the integration of brain and cultural research to understand how humans induce variation in their own nervous system. He is the co-editor with Daniel Lendy of the leading sort of a piece foundational book on neuroanthropology, The Encultured Brain, an introduction to neuroanthropology. He's a professor at Macquarie University in Sydney and has won a tremendous number of teaching awards there. Greg also shares a St. Louis connection, which I promise it wasn't part of the panel. I went to the same grade school as Dr. Carter. I went to the same high school as Dr. Downey, and we didn't know this. So this is exciting. Dr. Downey, you want to say just a brief word about what folks might come talk with you about in your breakout room around neuroanthropology?
Look, I'm happy to talk about careers or education. I mean, I'm really interested in cognitive diversity and how it translates into neurological diversity. So I've had the good fortune to study capoeira practitioners in Brazil, cage fighters, people in Fiji, blind folks who echolocate, free divers. But I'm basically interested in how folks use systematic practice to transform the brain. So I'm happy to talk about careers. I'm also happy to talk about like educational futures, but I'll keep it short. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you. This just in, Kelly Mahaffey, also from St. Louis. The St. Louis Mafia has apparently taken over the neuro world. This is the sub headline of the evening. Okay, so here is what we will do. I'm going to hit a button in a second, which will open up the breakout rooms. For those you can jump into any breakout room you want. You can kind of jump around. And then it looks like Dr. Phillips is able to stay, Marcia is able to stay for a few minutes in this main room. I'll stay in the main room. So if you have questions for the two panelists or for me, I'll stick around here. I can also help direct traffic if you want to get to a breakout room. Otherwise, I've opened the rooms and I will help our presenters get there. And then we can stick around here and have discussion as well. So thanks to everyone. We're coming back from the breakout rooms. Thank you, Dr. Phillips. I don't know if you knew you signed up for a full 2-hour shift, but we'll double what we pay you. It was really cool to hear about this. I hope we'll have a way to connect sometime in the future and stay in touch. And thank you for being here. Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks to all our breakout room leaders. It's a wrap for our second night. So thank you. Thanks, students, for being here. Come back tomorrow if you'd like. We do it all again with a whole new cast, a whole new crew, neuroethics, neurolaw.